everyone. Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here. I have a special interview guest with me here today, James O'Keefe, the founder and head of Project Veritas, the Muckraker in chief, as some call him. He has a new book out, aptly named American Muckraker. At least it's coming out soon, available soon here and everywhere, online and hopefully in your bookstores. James, good to be with you again.
Great to be with you, Tom.
Well, I love what you do because you kind of do and you kind of have the attitude, dare I say it, that Judicial Watch has, that you are willing to ask the tough questions about issues the media would like to avoid. I see you get into a little bit of it in your book, not only, where you're coming from, but where the whistleblowers you work with, which are essential to your work, are coming from. Where does that kind of energy and motivation come from in terms of holding the government and, the quasi-government, mainly big corporations, to account?
Good question, Tom. Thanks for talking to me about this book, American Muckraker. It comes out next week. It took me 5 years to write this book, and your question really is central. It's what motivates someone to do this? Why would you go through all this pain and struggle and sacrifice and litigation and attacks on your reputation? Because you do get attacked, even when you're doing the right thing, especially when you tell the truth. There's a perverse incentive that exists in our society to not tell the truth, so you avoid all these pitfalls. But I think it stems from I think Mike Wallace once said this, the guy who was no longer alive, but he was working at 60 Minutes for many decades, is he said in a book called Raising Hell, he said, "Things are not as they seem and rarely as they ought to be." And when you have a passion for exposing things and you have a vision for seeing the reality come to bear, you're kind of willing to endure a lot of the attacks. And this book talks about a lot of those attacks. In fact, the first chapter of this book is called Suffering, right? The preface is called Suffering. And people might say, what does that have to do with journalism? I think in a world where Judicial Watch is now uncovering that the FBI, DOJ is in talks with Pfizer Pharmaceutical about journalists and journalism, in that world that we live, a clown world, effectively. You kind of need a handbook to navigate that minefield. And this talks about how we got there and how to endure that. I think people who are passionate about it, people who believe in the truth, you're only entitled to one reality. There's not multiple realities unless you're Stephen Hawking. There's only one reality out there. So it's not really an ideological book or a political book. It's really a book about truth-telling in clown world.
It's important that listeners know. I mean, you work with whistleblowers. Judicial Watch has worked with whistleblowers, and we all know the risks that whistleblowers bear when they come forward, and you highlight that. But what has kind of changed with your emergence on the scene is that the punishments normally reserved for whistleblowers, threats, arrests, harassment, are now or been elevated to the journalists that expose what the whistleblowers have to offer. In your case, you had been arrested, prosecuted by the federal government on, in my view, trumped up charges. So I don't know what you're allowed to say about that. You had your home raided recently by the FBI, evidently to help Ashley Biden and protect her and her father, completely political. And then, as you point out, more recently, we uncovered, because, what from our perspective about you is, okay, you're doing great work. From our anti-corruption perspective, we see the government punishing you and violating your civil rights. So we're going to ask questions about it. And we asked questions because we knew something was up. We had suspicion something was up, mainly because Pfizer admitted something was up, that Pfizer was working with the FBI to target you. And incredibly, the FBI just admitted it to us the other day. We asked for the records, and they said, well, we can't give you the records because they're in a file about James Keefe. We're targeting him on Project Veritas. So, I mean, talk about the personal risk. And you highlight nicely and appropriately in your book the personal risk, your whistleblowers, and that we all know, like David Dandelion and people like that, who helped uncover the fetal organ black market, or I shouldn't say gray, I guess it's more of a white market because it's done out in the open, on how he was targeted. But I don't know if our listeners know the risks that you've borne as a result of your work in this area.
Well, it could. I'm very blessed to do what I love, and it has been painful. And the raid against me in February was psychologically, I guess you could say, traumatizing. I had a little bit of PTSD, particularly after the ordeal in New Orleans from 10 years ago, which is its own separate book and story. And those prosecutors all were disbarred, by the way, in New Orleans for what they did to me and other people. They were anonymously blogging about me while they were prosecuting me. A lot of injustice in our Department of Justice, as your audience is well aware. So I think it was traumatizing. It was scary in that day or two, because when the feds do this to you, to an innocent man, your mind races. What on earth are they doing? How could they have crossed this Rubicon? What other bridges are they willing to cross if they're willing to cross this one? The Supreme Court has established in Bartnicki v. Vopper, a 2001 case authored by John Paul Stevens, the right of a journalist, someone who is interested in the public right to know, to broadcast and publish documents that were stolen by a third party, as long as the journalist did not participate in the theft of those documents. This is as American as apple pie. People in government are not going to willingly, hi, I'm Tom Fitton from Judicial Watch. Tell me all the fraud you're committing. People are not going to admittedly confess their fraud and malfeasance. So it was shocking to me. And I felt a degree of pain, and the first chapter of this book talks about the pain that David DeLayden felt, the Planned Parenthood body parts issue, the Andy Ngo, the guy in Portland who was physically assaulted with cement milkshakes, by
Antifa.
By Antifa, and the pain and the suffering and the sacrifice. In combat, events have a duration of moments, maybe minutes, but if you're a whistleblower, the people that we work with, it's a different type of torment. You're assaulted psychologically, you're assaulted financially, which is its own special type of violence because it's directed at your children. And ultimately, we have to figure out what type of world we want to live in. I quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn in this book. The Soviet Union was a world where people the lie became a permanent form of existence. People had to survive no matter what. It's a dangerous thing when you place your own material well-being ahead of your own conscience, because ultimately you live in a world where people sort of have to constantly betray each other on behalf of the state. And I don't want to live in that world. And the whistleblowers we work with increasingly don't, and they are willing to follow their conscience to the gates of hell. It's just this book tells their stories and what they've had to endure.
And you use I want to focus on the word you use, which is betrayal. I mean, what's up. You're not surprised by what you find. I mean, obviously you're surprised by the specifics, but generally you know what's up. People like David, they know what's up. David's the activist. He knows what Planned Parenthood's about, and he exposed it. But the corporate whistleblowers, some of the government whistleblowers, what motivates them, it strikes me, looking at your book, is betrayal. These are folks who are working at a big tech company or working at the government, and they are there because they like the job, they like what they're doing professionally, they like the corporate culture or the corporation's product that they're producing, and they think it's great, and they're all on board. The same for the government whistleblowers. They're there to perform public service work. They understand they're working for the public, and they think there's a job to do, and it needs to be done fully, honestly, with in a way that the taxpayers get value for their money. And oftentimes they come forward, it strikes me, looking at your book, and you can expand on this, it's because they've been betrayed.
Right.
They've been betrayed by the folk they're working for, whether it be the private sector or the public sector.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. The whistleblowers, Carrie Porch at CNN, who got the Jeff Zucker phone calls and recordings, on one hand, you'd think that, well, he's betraying CNN. But what he said was that CNN betrayed him. And the whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, most famous whistleblower, probably of the 20th century, he said to be a whistleblower, it's like being a spacewalking astronaut whose lifeline to the mothership has been disconnected. You're sort of floating out there. You're not part of any organization anymore. They're not actually part of Project Veritas. They don't work for me. They transmit information to me, and sometimes we give them cameras. But to be a whistleblower is to step outside the great chain of being. And historically, in the 20th century, if you were Jeffrey Wigand, like the guy who blew the whistle on Big Tobacco, there's a whole movie about that called The Insider. It's one of my favorite movies. Is that his wife left him. He was being intimidated by these powerful corporate forces. But these days, you have recourse. You have social media. You have technology. You have GoFundMe, and if GoFundMe bans you, you have Give, Send, Go, which is a Christian alternative fundraising website. So in other words, there's life after whistleblowing. And the second variable is that I think people are placing more of a value on politics than they ever have. In other words, they're placing more of a value on society, and they're willing to give it all up for the public knowing. I interview a lot of these people on the record, and they always say that I felt I had to do something. And I say, well, aren't you worried about losing your job? And they said, well, I have to do it. I have no choice. It's a choiceless choice, which is really inspirational. And I think it speaks to what Solzhenitsyn said, which is that on one hand, you follow your conscience and you lose your livelihood. But on the other hand, you don't follow your conscience and you can't live with yourself. And increasingly, a lot of people are willing to follow their conscience, do the right thing, and sacrifice so much. It's not as bad as you think. The mailman Richard Hopkins, who witnessed the backdating of ballots in Pennsylvania, was interrogated by a stereotypical guy from the deep state whose name was Russell Strasser from the Inspector General. And Richard Hopkins recorded it with his iPhone. He recorded this Soviet-like recanting, North Korea-like, you must recant your testimony. And just so powerful that he did that. And they really do fear being exposed, like the work Judicial Watch does. They fear you. And they're afraid to do the wrong thing for fear that Judicial Watch will expose them doing the wrong thing. And that's healthy.
Yeah, in the end, though, they can't help themselves.
That's true. That's true.
Too often. You talked about, I want to talk first about the betrayal, which is the misuse and abuse of, the public trust that the New York Times has as a result of its being the world's most important journalist publication. I mean, we may criticize the New York Times, but it's the most important media entity in the world, I would suggest, because it sets the agenda.
I agree.
For the rest of the big media.
I agree.
And their power is enormous in that regard. Yet, you sued them, and the evidence suggests, and I don't know how much you can get into this given the current state of the targeting of you, the evidence suggests that because you sued them, they closely coordinated with the FBI and got illegal leaks to target you, and that is kind of part and parcel of the raid on your home and the subsequent publication. And I know everyone argues as to whether one is tied to the other, but I can draw my own conclusions based on the evidence out there of your confidential material, basically your attorney-client material. So you're suing the New York Times, and the New York Times then gets your materials that evidently the FBI somehow got and misuses that to, in the civil litigation, practically speaking, to punish you over the civil litigation you're bringing against them. I don't know if I'm kind of, maybe I've lost the listeners in the kind of labyrinth I've described here, but the New York Times is abusing their power because you sued them. And they're doing it in alliance with big government, namely the FBI.
Well, I can go one step further. But just by giving you the facts. Within minutes of the feds walking out of my apartment after they execute a search warrant, take my phones, which is its own topic we could spend 30 minutes on, unconstitutional violation of First Amendment rights. Within minutes of that happening, guess who I got a text message from? Mike Schmidt at the New York Times. National security. I'm holding... my wrists are still sore from the handcuffs that have been taken off, and I'm holding in my hand a search warrant signed by a magistrate judge, and somehow, magically, Mike Schmidt knows about the subjects of the search warrant. Now, the neighbors did not tell him that. So we have, in a world where the FBI and the New York Times are working in concert with each other, this is a problem, Tom, and you know about this. Everyone knows about this intuitively. But it's scary. And the New York Times has enormous power. We sued them for defamation in March. We got past motion to dismiss, which is very rare. And the judge in New York State, the Supreme Court of New York, said that the New York Times acted with disinformation and deception towards Project Veritas. They did precisely the thing they accuse us of doing. By the way, that's what they always do. They accuse us of what they do, deceptive editing, chopping the quotes. And they say this in court, and the New York Times admitted in court documents, Tom, the New York Times admitted they got the facts wrong in this article they had written about me. They said this in court, but they still refused to correct the article. What is that if not disinformation? So in that context, then somehow the New York Times gets my illegally obtained or improperly obtained attorney-client memos and publishes them, which, by the way, these memos made me look good. They said we don't break the law, but it's the principle. In a defamation lawsuit, they published Ben Barr, my attorney of record, in that case. And people say, well, James, you're trying to do prior restraint against the press. No, it's litigation misconduct. I'm winning a defamation lawsuit. I scored a victory in the suit, and they work in concert with the FBI. My question to Mike Schmidt is, why aren't you investigating the FBI? Because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them all the information.
Yeah, and that's what, I don't know if we disagree, because I don't know if I've discussed this fully with you, but, I've always been a little bit more skeptical than others have been about the protections that journalists have from discovery or inquiry in the courts into how they operate. Because in our experience, the government often abuses whistleblowers through journalists. So this protection that journalists have that's so important, allegedly, this, I think, protection that's unwarranted, they get more protection than regular citizens do in some respects, is often used to enable government corruption.
Yes.
As opposed to protect us from government corruption.
Because they represent.
I think that's the interesting twist on that. Before we go, I want to talk about this big tech issue, because you talk about disinformation, and, it just occurred to me, Twitter not only banned you and Project Veritas, but they're so afraid of you. They've changed their rules to make it impossible to put videos up of the work that you do.
Yeah.
Because remember, they changed the rules to say, people who are videotaped essentially by journalists, we're going to take them down if you post them. And we know that rule is only applied to groups like Project Veritas, not to other journalists. I mean, talk about your challenges and the challenges your whistleblower colleagues and allies have had with big tech, and what do you think is the way forward and the way out on for those of us who have been censored, suppressed, and at perpetual threat of deplatforming completely by big tech?
That's quite a question, Tom. That's two different issues. Privacy, there's a chapter in this book called Privacy. It's really about the boundaries of privacy. Twitter saying you can't I think you're referencing the Twitter policy about non-consensual recordings, which is an absurd. It's illogical, it's irrational, it's obviously subjective, because of course they're going to allow hidden camera journalism into animal abuse. They would never ban such a video. So really this is not about the methods, it's about the findings. And that's what I uncovered in my research on ethics and privacy. They'll claim it's about methods, subterfuge, undercover, but think of it. Obviously, ethics is situational, depend upon whether or not the audience thinks there's a compelling public interest in what you're being exposed. And we would argue that hidden camera journalism, that is to say, the person does not know they're being recorded so long as you're with them. We think that the hidden camera is an extension of the reporter's notebook. We think that surely society would not consider reasonable an expectation of privacy, which would consider a less accurate version of the events in question, namely a pencil and paper account of what happened, versus a recorded account of what happened. So all of these arguments fail in court. They fail on every level. They fail logically if you think about it. And it has nothing to do with privacy. It has to do with the dignity, That is to say, the person wants control over dissemination of their own imagery. These arguments have failed historically. They're un-American. They're unconstitutional. Even Upton Sinclair, when he wrote The Jungle, admitted that he dramatized and added color to his reporting. So we think that filming something rather than writing about it is so much more important because images transfix. And as Marshall McLuhan stated, the image is more powerful than the politician. So Twitter's policy is going to fall apart. We always win in court, Tom. And in regards to the deposition issue, they keep secrets. I don't keep secrets. Please do depose me. I've been deposed many times. I love being deposed. Love talking about what we're doing. They have so much to hide. So that's why they stopped suing Project Veritas, because they're afraid of discovery. And that's why.
So listeners know, if you sue, everyone says, I want to sue this person. Well, there's pluses and minuses to pursuing litigation. Some of the minuses are that you're subject to evidence gathering by folks you don't like. So you may think the other guy's terrible, but you sue them. Well, the other guy then gets to ask you some tough questions. And that's why you suggest that you've faced less litigation than you used to, because they recognize they've got a lot on the line if you start getting into what they're up to.
In the deposition of AFT Michigan, who sued us for breach of duty and these weird issues they should never sue journalists for, in the depositions, the president of the Teachers Union of Michigan said, I'm paraphrasing, the goal of this lawsuit is to stop James O'Keefe using any means necessary, to stop him from doing his journalism. And I put the video of David Hecker on YouTube, and they did not like that. They're in their paradigm, they don't think that that's possible. They keep these secrets. And when you in the discovery process of a lawsuit, like in the New York Times admitted in court documents during the discovery process after motion to dismiss that they got the facts wrong in the article. And of course, we've trumpeted that from the mountaintops, and they don't like that. The only thing, Tom, these people fear is what Judicial Watch does. I think they fear Judicial Watch more than they fear Congress. They fear exposure. They don't fear, forgive me, but they don't fear Republican lawmakers. They fear being exposed. And that's what this book is about, but it's about obviously what you have to endure doing this, because you're going to get attacked, and be prepared for it. Be prepared for the struggle. It's real.
So talk quickly before we go about big tech and your challenges there, and I don't want to let's not whine about it. I mean, we all know we're being suppressed and censored. What do you think we should do about it?
I think we should break stories I think we need to just break stories that are so compelling nobody can ignore them. That's the solution.
Just keep working.
Well, but do journalism, you do, documents, DOJ. It'll effuse its way out there, even onto Twitter. The story we did last week on literally the Pentagon Papers, the Department of Defense documents, was the #1 trending story on Twitter, even though I'm banned on Twitter. So stop whining. Just go out there and get the material. It'll force people to talk about it. Content is king, to quote the former Viacom CEO. If the story is compelling enough, it will trend on all platforms. We've proved that. Just keep working. And I got to wrap up here because I'm running up into another.
Okay. Well, where can folks get your new book, and when specifically is it coming out?
Comes out on Tuesday, the 25th of January next week. American Muckraker is the name of the book. All proceeds go to our nonprofit. Help support Project Veritas. Pick up a copy of the book and learn what it takes to be a journalist.
So that's great. So if again, listeners, if you want to support Project Veritas, a great way to do it and educate yourself is to buy James's excellent new book, American Muckraker. James, I know you got to go. I appreciate the time you've given Judicial Watch. We look forward to continuing to battle the bad guys with you. We are allies and we support you. And I know our supporters support you. And millions of citizens who don't directly support you obviously are praying for you and pushing your work as best as they're able, given the circumstances they're in. God bless you, and we'll see you here soon, I hope, with some more big news about what you're up to. Thank you.
We appreciate you, Tom. Thank you.